So in the interview that you're about to hear, one of our guests mentions a thing that he wrote on Facebook, and we never actually got to talk about specifically what that was, but I want to read it for you now to launch off the episode. So this is Sharad Yadav. If Kierkegaard is right, and all distinctions between the many different kinds of love are essentially abolished by Christianity, then the beauty of that vision which entices me to follow the breadcrumbs of joy found in its daily foreshadowing, in casually spoken kindnesses, routine dignities, regular human regard, actually invites an impossible burden into my life. If I were to stoop to look at the stained and dilapidated face piled on top of the crumpled garbage lying against the bus stop, only to see my father, or to spy two police officers fist-bumping one another with sickening bravado after dislocating an elderly Alzheimer's patient's shoulder, only to recognize my own brother and sister, and on, multiplied by every conceivable human failure and tragedy. How would life cease to be a horror? Why would anyone willingly thaw that blessed insensitivity which allows us to live with such ubiquitous pain? Christ's passion is the only version of love that seems to notice that when you open yourself to the world, it will crucify you. After having fallen in love with his vision, I feel doomed to the necessity of it, because I am wedded to the hope of it. I very often find that to be a misery, not a joy. When I hear Peter's words, "To whom else should we go? For you have the words of life," it's hard for me not to sympathize with the tragic desperation of that sentiment. The idea of human brotherhood no longer warms my heart as much as it terrifies me with its awesome emotional demands. Well, welcome to A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar. Today on the show, we're talking with a couple of guys that I've been wanting to have on the show for a long time and was fortunate enough to get them both on simultaneously. And that is Sameer and Sharad Yadav, who are identical twin brothers. One of them is a pastor in Portland. The other is a theologian in Santa Barbara, California, but also basically a philosopher. He works on issues that are very philosophical. So they're basically the perfect pair of people to have on our show.
Yeah.
And this is just a really delightful but also profound conversation that we're going to have. So you're in for a treat.
Yeah. And I mean, super fun conversation. I don't think I've laughed that much during an episode yet. And also just want to say there is a little bit of swearing. So you might want, if you're listening in the car with your kids, wait or put on earbuds, but get ready. It's a fun episode.
Yeah, good stuff. And we have something fun to drink today, too, that I'm really excited about. So I texted Elliot today randomly asking him when his birthday was, and it turns out that it's in 4 days?
Yeah.
So I've been sitting on this. I bought it specifically for you because it's called Elliot. So this is the first mead we've had on the show. So not a beer, not a whiskey, not a wine.
I'm excited.
This is, some people claim, the oldest beverage humans have ever made. I don't know if there's good evidence that it's actually older than wine or beer, but maybe it is. I don't know.
Dr. Pepper?
Basically. Yeah. Other than Dr. Pepper, the oldest beverage. Right. Basically, every country that has a long history has some version of mead in their history. Basically, just a fermented honey beverage. So you can think of it as wine, but made from honey instead of grapes. So what we have in front of us is from a place called Manic Meadery in Crown Point, Indiana. And this is a melomel, which means it's mead with fruit. So this is a blueberry mead. And I'm gonna say something strong here, say something extreme, but I think mead, particularly melomels, are the best tasting things in existence.
Whoa!
Now I haven't had this one, so I can't make that claim for this one. But I've had meads that I would take over any whiskey, any wine, any beer. The last thing I want to have in my mouth when I die is a mead.
Brady's shaking his head for
So this one's called Elliot. Happy birthday.
Yeah.
Elliot.
Cheers.
I have never had a mead.
I've had a mead, but it was the what's the fermented honey and water, and that's it. What's
just traditional? Yeah, it doesn't really have a fancy name.
I've had a traditional mead. I want to sit and smell this before I dive in,
definitely
because the
take a
nose
big
is
whiff.
just crazy. Oh, I want like air freshener that smells like this. This is just it smells like summer and wildflowers and like honey-ish. I mean, I could just smell this. You want to taste this when you die? I want to just smell this when I die.
Yeah. So they say that this is 1 pound of blueberries and half a pound of honey for every bottle.
Say that again.
Whoa.
A pound of blueberries and half a pound of honey per bottle.
That's nuts.
And they use orange blossom honey.
This is delightful.
Orange blossom honey.
Yeah.
But it's way so for all of that concentrated flavor in this bottle, I would never imagine it because it's very subtle. Like it's
Yeah, even if you use honey in cooking, often it can overpower the dish. It's the only thing you get. You can tell there's honey in here, but not that much honey. That's insane.
Yeah, and it's pretty expensive honey too.
this
apparently.
is such a sensual experience. I mean,
I'm telling you, man.
you lift the glass to your mouth and your world gets lightened by the aroma, and then you taste it, and it's less than you think you're going to be getting, but it's just right.
Yeah.
This is
It's really
friggin'
impossible
ridiculous.
to describe a good melomel to somebody who's not had one.
I mean, it's like this is a dessert wine.
Oh, for
to me.
sure. For
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
And this is 14%, so it comes in like a strong wine, basically.
And it's so smooth.
Yeah. You have to be careful with this stuff.
I'm in love.
And this is a still mead, which means it's not carbonated, as you can see. It's just kind of viscous and
It
freely
would be
flowing
interesting
in
if
glass.
this was carbonated.
So there are
It's a little syrupy,
there are
though.
carbonated meads, and
Yeah.
I don't prefer them, but I've had some pretty good ones. So
Oh,
Someday I'm gonna make that highlight reel of all of Randy's reaction noises, just back to back to back.
That'll be a
I'll listen
special
to it. I'll decide this is a bad idea, and I will not save it.
special Patreon release. Randy going for an hour.
I don't care what you say. Mead exists because God loves us. I mean,
For sure, dude. For sure.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, you're.
When it's my birthday, do I get a bottle of that?
you get
I
the
can get
Randy
you something.
mead.
Yeah, I can find you something. I have, no joke, probably 50 bottles of mead at home. So
For real?
yeah, it's a little bit of a problem.
All right, so you're very overstated. I would prefer this to any whiskey, any bourbon, a good
Yeah.
mead. I don't know if I totally agree, but now what you said isn't ridiculous to me.
Yeah,
So,
good.
Yeah,
good.
thanks
and
for sharing this.
Yeah, and this is good. And this is, I think, the mead that put them on the map.
Yeah.
That was their most popular to begin with, and they have a bunch of versions of it, like Breakfast Elliot, which has like coffee in it, and I've got a chocolate one at home, so it's like chocolate and blueberry.
I don't want that.
But like on the level of meads that I've had, this is pretty middle of the road. So, so
I mean,
put that
I don't want to enter into your binary world of having to like compete against whiskeys and beers and wines. This is just pure delight in a cup.
And a lot of meads are aged in like really nice whiskey barrels and stuff too. So
We've already talked about it way too long, so let's finish up the tasting to say, if you find a mead, buy it.
yeah. Cheers.
right.
Cheers.
Yeah, cheers.
Well, Sameer and Sharad Yadav, thanks so much for being on A Pastor and Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, thanks.
It's great.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Can both of you tell us just a little bit about your background or who you are, why are you on the show?
Other than that, I
That's a
begged you.
Good question. I was going to say,
Why are we on the show?
yeah, what are we doing? My press agent said this would be good for my, I gave you guys all the headshots. I hope you got them. But no, I think it's, finding out about your show is pretty cool because it's sort of, the title of it is like the description of our relationship. So,
Exactly.
so it's kind of cool. Yeah, so Sameer and I, we obviously sucked nutrients from the same placenta growing up, and we
Good
were,
love.
identical twins, monozygotic, so same DNA, same infirmities, same devastating good looks. And I think the conversion experience that I had in college is kind of where all this started. And then shortly after my conversion experience, Sameer sort of said, I guess I'll walk in here and take a look around. And he and I both, in different ways, I think, have been trying to prosecute what it means to be a Christian, or why we think that would be something we would want to do as our career choices. So that's the sphere in which we work out our anxieties and our own questions about whether any of this stuff makes any sense. And so
Yeah.
Sameer went the academic route and I went the pastoral route. And we took a little detour into a testicle-crushing fundamentalism. So anyway, but yeah,
We each got one left, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. being twins, we can also be donors for each other, so that's pretty cool.
It worked out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, one kind of feature of that story is that my parents immigrated to the United States from India, and then moved to Kansas, and from Kansas to Idaho, and then we were born and raised in rural Idaho, and so our upbringing was one marked by a sort of profound questions of belonging and sort of existential issues and struggle that raised religious questions. I think both of us were unusually contemplative, reflective types, for just in part in response to the pressures of the kind of environment in which we were growing up. And so a lot of working out of various questions about what is life in the world and everything about were shaped in a very particular kind of social context, in which it's easier to ask those questions when pieces don't fit properly. So I think that's something that we've continued in our own different ways to reflect on, and has shaped our respective vocations in perhaps different ways, but also overlapping ways that we continue to work out in our relationship over time.
Yeah. Well, I would love for you to take us into that a little bit, if you're willing to. I mean, you said it, Sharad, you're a pastor. Sameer, you're I'm going to say philosopher, even though I think your degree is technically in theology, but you wrote your dissertation
I'm a trained theologian who does some philosophy of religion and philosophy.
Sure, yeah. Anybody that wrote a dissertation on William Alston is a philosopher, in my opinion. So,
and Jean-Luc Marion.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
And you cite a
and
bunch
I
of
think
philosophers.
Wilfred Sellers is in his marriage vows someplace. So he's definitely a philosopher. So ask wife and family what they have to deal with.
Yeah. Nice. So, have there been areas where Sharad's pastoral gifting or vocation has actually informed your scholarship? Same thing in the other direction. What take us into your conversations a little bit, if you can.
I would say that I thought about this a little bit in anticipation of our conversation, and it's such a difficult question to answer because I don't think of the way in which Sharad's ministry and pastoral vocation informs my work as being a really discrete kind of thing. It's much more like the kind of work he does is informed by his own attempting to take seriously his Christian confession and to help others to think about what it might mean to take that seriously and to be part of that discernment together in a way that has practical stakes, so that one is invested in the answer to that question in the way that one prosecutes the everyday features of one's life. And I think that kind of vocation is one that overlaps substantially with my own. So I think that one dimension to attempting to take one's Christian confession seriously and to help others to make a venture as to what that might look like in their lives, one dimension of that is intellectual and educative. So there's a natural connection to the kind of work that I do as a theologian. I mean, to be a theologian is just to have a vested interest in the truth of the subject matter that you're investigating. In this case, questions about God's relationship to the world and stuff like that. And so, there are those questions that get manifest differently in this context, but it's in the context of doing academic work or whatever. But there's a sense in which teaching students is a kind of spiritual formation by way of contemplation. And I think that there's something about that work that is deeply resonant with the pastoral work and particularly the kind of pastoral work that my brother does. So I think that, but let me put it this way though, one's practical vested interests in the questions one asks as an academic sometimes have to be backgrounded rather than foregrounded, right? They're not like what you're actually investigating. They're just kind of a program running in the background. Whereas it's front and center for what Sharad does. And so when we talk, it has the ability to be a front and center conversation that is explicit. Like, why does this actually matter? How does this actually work? And those kinds of questions. And so that's the kind of stuff we talk about.
Yeah, I like the background, foreground kind of thing, because I think that works pretty well as an analogy to how Sameer works for me too. I mean, what he's describing, I think, it's like all of the work that Sameer does in theology and race and in apophaticism and mysticism and concepts of wonder and all this work he does is deeply existentially motivated. It's like it's rooted not just in who he is, but he's not just doing conceptual analysis as a kind of like gymnastic fun. Mm-hmm. He's got real stakes in the questions that he's trying to come at, and he takes them pretty seriously. And I think maybe our relationship connects with each other over those existential concerns, because neither one of us want to believe bullshit, And I think his scholarly work then sort of like is standing in the background of I kind of think about like the album cover of In Fear of a Black Planet, like that Public Enemy album, where the guys are just standing in the background with their sunglasses on. And so every time I am preaching or teaching or counseling, I've got Sameer standing in the background guarding the door as a kind of, is what I am saying, does it really make any sense? Is it in good conscience something that I can commend to somebody and not be a kind of used car salesman, And I think Sameer is wanting to not be just a kind of academic fraud, really, like somebody who's engaging this work for whatever the vicious reasons might be for that, to build a name or a career or just to publish for his own self-satisfaction. I mean, there's deeper things at stake, and I think we both help shape the way we come at it with people.
Yeah, or to descend into mere puzzle solving, like where you just sort of like, oh, here's something that you can kind of fiddle with and work a thing so that you can crank an article out of it or something. I mean, that's not. I'm just not interested in that.
Yeah.
And one of the to say I'm not interested, it doesn't mean I'm not tempted to that. But part of the anchoring of our relationship is to keep a kind of focus on the work that religious questions actually do. Like what work gets done by asking and answering these questions.
Is that how it works for you guys? I mean, do you have a similar dynamic with both of you?
Well, we didn't share a womb, so it's a little bit different. Yeah. I mean, Randy's my pastor, so we just had a bunch of conversations for several years about intellectual and theological things, and then we started doing these Q&As at our church where I would MC and then kind of help out with some of the more academic questions, and we realized we had a nice dynamic, and people told us we should have a podcast, so here we are. It's really not that complicated.
You don't have to do everything everyone says. No, that's...
Then we realized we could talk to people like you by just asking. So it pays for itself, for sure.
I would say that Kyle's influence has definitely in some whether they're small or large ways influenced the way I teach and preach, particularly. Bringing like this idea of epistemic humility is something that I wasn't in my orb until Kyle came into my world, and hopefully I had some innately in there. But he's helped me pay attention a lot more to it. And also this idea of certainty. There's a number of things that Kyle and his philosophical questions and just dealing with what's real has really, really shaped and influenced and helped me like look at things differently and also make sure that I'm not talking bullshit, like you said.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, that's really cool. I think that's the gift of it, is that there's a kind of... I have a form of accountability with Sameer that I don't have with anybody else.
Likewise. One of the I recently, not terribly recently, but there was like this theological journal, online journal called Syndicate, and one of the things that they did was to do a kind of study of the state of theological academy, contemporary state of the academy, and some of the problems that have arisen in relationship to certain different kinds of confessional schools where theology gets done. And one of the perennial things that comes up in conversations about theological work is the divide between church and academy, so that you have academic theologians and then you have like actual Christian constituents, and constituencies, and that never the twain shall meet, except if you have constituencies who are putting a drag on confessional institutions to limit academic freedom in ways that are problematic for those people, or you have, on the other hand, you have a despising of the church by the theologian as some kind of lowbrow sphere of people who don't know what they're talking about or doing. And so it's really the kind of sense of mutual responsibility to one another in terms of academic theology and the life of the church is voluntary.
Yeah.
It's kind of voluntary, but there's a sense in which my relationship to my brother is involuntary. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And so there's a kind of accountability in that. That is something that I think would be great if it could be propagated more widely,
Yeah. I've mentioned several times on the show that I have a text thread with a couple other philosophers that we've had going for probably 5 or 6 years. And it's something similar to that. Like I tell my students that philosophy gives you a superpower of bullshit detection.
Yeah, exactly.
You can see through anything, but like, it's nice when it's invited.
Yeah, exactly.
To know that someone's going to call it. Like, I might get a text after this episode from one of those dudes telling me that thing you said was really stupid.
My detector was going crazy when I,
Like they listen to this.
Exactly. Actually, they do, which kind of scares me. So
Doesn't scare me. Hi, guys.
I feel like I've been in your heads for the last week. I've been reading your articles, Sameer. I've been listening to a bunch of your sermons, Sharad.
Oh my Lord!
Yeah, just to kind of prepare to know what sorts of questions to ask. So I've got a few that I want to touch, things that you've written on, Sameer, and things that you've said, Sharad. And I'd love to get your take on both of them, even if it's not something you yourself said. So one kind of big question that I want to ask you, Sameer, is, and it's as general as I can make it, what is theology? So you wrote a paper where you're kind of giving what you call a meta dogmatics. You don't have to go into all that, but just very basically for listeners who haven't really thought about it. Here, let me frame it this way.
Yeah.
There are people who call themselves theologians who are Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, feminist, womanist, liberation theologians, analytic theologians, postmodernists, even atheists. Okay, we had a famous atheistic theologian at my alma mater. So what is it that all those people are doing that is the same thing? if there is such a thing. And then the second part to the question is, how is that thing different from what philosophers do? Because I know you're very informed on the philosophical methods as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think that this is actually that difficult a question, which is a good sign that I probably got it wrong. But
I mean, I just looked it up on Wikipedia and it said right there.
Webster's defines theology.
Yes.
That sounds like a pastor.
No.
Exactly.
Well, in the
Shit,
Greek.
it's Saturday.
What I tell my intro to Christian doctrine students, that I teach every two sections every semester, and that's how I start the class, is talking about what is theology, and what I say is all it is to do theology is to ask what must or might be the case if some story is correct. A particular story about, in the case of Christian theology, it's a story about God's relationship to the world and a story of creation and redemption and that kind of thing. Other kind of theologies are theologies about God, so theology can only be done by asking what must or might be the case if some story about God is correct, right? But then it's just working out some kind of ontological commitments, or like what are you committed to in virtue of some said story. And that's something that anyone who has a story about God can do, right? So anybody who has a story about God and what we might have to do with God or what we don't have to do with God, or whether the concept of God commits you to the existence of God or not, or whatever, anybody can try to work out the implications of what must or might be the case if that story is correct. And that's all it is to do theology, is to think hard about that. And theology is therefore something that is about ontological commitment, but depending on one's story about God, it might also involve certain kinds of other kinds of commitments, practical commitments. What must or might I have to do if this story is correct? So there's other kinds of commitments other than the ontological ones, but those ones tend to be the centering questions in the work of theology.
Yeah. Didn't you say a few minutes ago, though, that to be a theologian is to have some kind of practical investment in the questions that you're studying?
It is. To be a Christian theologian is to do that, right? To be a Christian theologian. But I don't presume to say what but you want me to answer the question, what is theology in the most generic across the board sense? That might be true. And I don't think that practical investments are a given for every kind of theology. I can imagine certain kinds of theology in which the practical question is of little or no consequence at all. I wouldn't. Now, given my commitments about what theology is, I might say that's bad theology, but I wouldn't say it's not theology at all. That it doesn't count as theology.
Sure.
And so the second part of that question, sorry about the philosophy. How does it relate to philosophy? I mean, philosophy can help us work at the notions of ontological commitment involved. It can help us with the inferential work that might be involved. It can be a way of helping us to understand what the credences and epistemic status is of the inferential work we're doing and trying to do that work, right? There's all kinds of ways in which philosophy is useful for that task, But one can imagine doing philosophical work where what one is trying to do is not necessarily that task of trying to say what must or might be the case if some story about God is right. Mm-hmm. So there can be a distinction, therefore, between philosophy and theology. And I mean, there's some version of this kind of way of making the distinction is, I think, what you find in Aquinas. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a legitimate kind of philosophy-theology distinction, but it's not a mutual exclusivity kind of thing, because obviously doing the work of theology kind of propels you into doing philosophical kind of things, reasoning, for example, right? So
yeah, and that commitment to a story that you begin with, trying to work out the coherence of those commitments inside some story, is itself even a kind of approach to theology, a kind of post-liberal approach to theology. And I think you could even step back and say, just in the most generic, probably unhelpful sense, I guess, but theology is just, it's the discipline of trying not to say dumb things about God. You know, it's like, you know, how do we talk about this, you know, whatever it is you mean by it, how do we talk about God? And so you can see why theology would be super important for ministers. I mean, it's like that's their job. They have to talk about God all the time. And so theologians are working out in different, maybe narrative contexts, amongst different communities, how to make sense of their own community's claims about those things, how it works inside those communities.
So you sort of just answered my next question to you, which is the version of the question I just asked Sameer. Like, how do you understand the vocation of a pastor? And I'm particularly interested in some I've talked about with friends for a long time. Is there an expertise involved in pastoring?
Yeah, I love that question.
So
man,
what is it?
Because I think pastors, generally speaking, are hacks at other things that they should have probably done instead. They are middle managers, they are bureaucrats, they are marketing people, they are musicians, they are stand-up comedians, they are fill in the blank. That's probably what they should have done instead, but they just kind of try to hose the Jesus juice on whatever it is they you know, whatever thing that floats their boat vocationally, which means that most pastors, I think, don't have a sense for what they do in any distinction from one of those other vocations. It's almost like we're all of those things. We're bad therapists and theologians and etc. Anyway, yeah, maybe some of my self-loathing is coming into that answer, but also I think there is a historical definition of what a pastor is that actually is the only reason I'm interested in it. And that definition has to do with facilitating a person's union with God. So I think a pastor's vocation actually makes them mostly irrelevant to all of those other things. Other people are better at those things. Other people's jobs are to do those things. But what I want to do is to be the one person who has no agenda for your life, that's not trying to cram you into anything. And my job is to pay attention to you and to pay attention to the divine life inside of you, and to help draw your own attention to the workings of God inside the shape of your life, however it's given.
Oh, that's nice.
So, and that work is not deeply sought after. Not a lot of people are in line wanting that work. Most people sort of, I think, want a pastor to answer unanswerable questions. They want pastors to give vision and direction that takes the responsibility off of them to actually know what God is doing in their own life. They want pastors to, in some ways, take up the unique burdens and struggles that attend Christian vocation, Christian belonging, and sort of chew that food for people and then spit it back into their mouths.
Or these days, just affirm what all the cable news tells them to think, right?
Exactly.
Affirm everything that they believe already.
Right. So that I stated it in a very highly individualistic sense, that this contemplative work of spiritual direction, prayer, and attending to the voice of God inside of people's lives. But also there's a communal work to it, which is that the job of the people of God together is to provide some kind of corporate witness to the life of God in the world today. So just like a theologian's job is intellectually to say, how is this story coherent? What ontological commitments would I have to make in order for this story to believe this story? A church is a living community that says, what would this community have to be like if any of this story was true? You know, what would the shape of our relationships be? What would the shape of our financial commitments be? What would the shape of our emotional and imaginative lives, our vocations? All of that is wrapped up in inhabiting this story of God's redemption in Christ.
And that's one of the scary things about being Christian and supposing that Christianity is correct. It's that one of its truth conditions, or a satisfaction condition, or the condition for the possibility of truth of Christianity, is that a certain kind of community exists.
Yeah.
Or can exist.
Yeah.
And if it can't or doesn't, then Christianity is false.
It's false. That's right. So what bears
So if that,
the way,
but if that's right,
Yeah.
then it's a natural joint between the work of theology and the work of pastoral ministry, right?
Exactly.
Because it's an attempt to figure out what are the truth conditions.
And that's why I think Sameer works for me. Sameer is just an aide on my cabinet. I feel like, the fact is all of the truth conditions of Christian belief rest on some living, breathing, incarnate community that says, look what sort of life is possible because there is a God and he is like the crucified Jesus.
Yep. I want to get your name right. Sharad, Sharad. How do we...
well, what we're going to have to do is conference call my mom. So you guys go ahead.
Just hold on.
Hold on. No, so I say Sharad. I've said Sharad since kindergarten because that's what other kids say, and they must be right. So, but my name is actually pronounced Sharad. Sharad. And not even my wife will do it. I mean, so I have... When I'm dead someday, which is the other job of a pastor, to focus everyone on the day of their own death, it's going to be really amazing to have people come through the mic and speak tearfully about me and say my name wrong. Like everyone will say my name wrong.
I refuse to do it though.
Sharad meant so much to me. Wait, who was that? Yeah. Anyway.
Nice. Sharad, could you tell us about your church?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So this is what was a non-denominational community that was planted about 10 years ago by a group of independent Bible church type folks from Arkansas. They came into Portland to save all the sodomites, and they planted this church that was really a pretty beautiful little collection of intentional communities. So they didn't even meet on Sunday mornings, really. They just had a kind of network of intentional communities that would reach out they moved to the poorest neighborhoods in the city, and they did really good work inviting people into their homes, into their lives. The problem was that the burden on these home church leaders, which were, mostly lay folks, was enormous. It was just so much work that it was just not sustainable. And then housing prices in Portland will get your ass kicked out of a neighborhood pretty quick. So, you'll get priced out through rent increases and things like that. So having a church organized around these communities proved to be pretty difficult. So it was pretty tumultuous, pretty emotionally draining. The main teaching pastor stepped out around 8 years ago, just totally burned out. And I was in a church in Idaho that I had planted as a personal therapy group for myself. And this church was doing fine. We had a handful of people that said, hey, as long as you want to make this thing work, we will pay your salary. So it was a sweet little time for me to recover from the 12 years of Bible church craziness, that I had in this fundamentalist environment. And in that little halfway house of safety and respite, I kind of felt like, I think I'm probably ready to go do something new again. So I moved to Portland. I'd heard about this church from friends of friends kind of a thing. They were in some of the same networks. And I said, here's all my baggage, here's all my doubts, here's all my convictions that differ from yours, and here's why you probably shouldn't hire me. And then they said, we could probably live with that. And then they took me on. So right now we've just made a move to the Evangelical Covenant Church as a denomination. So I've been moving away from a kind of conservative evangelicalism, Bible church kind of environment towards a more, I think, broad embrace of the Christian tradition. And so the ECC was founded as a denomination that said a credible conversion is all we need for membership, and that's it. No doctrinal gauntlet to run, that's it. And so it tries to embrace lots of different convictions in one in one family. So we're trying to live that out with 5 or so other covenant churches in Portland. And yeah, I mean, it's a mostly white church. So that's just like I grew up and just like I went to school. And
just like you'll die,
and just like I'll die. No, it's sad in some ways. I after George Floyd died, I've been wrestling pretty deeply with how much racial trauma Sameer and I have both experienced growing up, and what it's like to be in a white evangelical church ministering. So the beautiful thing about this denomination is that they have a very wonderful multi-ethnic ministry in the nation. I mean, they're one of the most diverse churches in the country, even though they're a smaller denomination. And my coaches and supervisors, they're all Chinese, Korean. We have a lot of influential black pastors in our network. And
yeah, the ECC is great denomination. I want to ask both of you, because I don't know about you, Sharad, but I've been doing a lot of big emotive thinking about the church these days, and what we see in the church, what we see going on, it's crazy. It's like the Wild West in the church in America, and churches are basically cut in half of what they were pre-COVID in many ways, and people aren't interested in the church, or people who are interested in the church are the crazies. There's just so much going on right now. As you look at the landscape of the American church right now, tell us your thoughts, what you think about, what you pray about, what keeps you up at night or not.
Well, fundamentally, man, what keeps me up at night is whether Christianity has anything to offer. That's what keeps me up at night. I mean, it's the most fundamental questions. And when I look at the American landscape of religion and spirituality, I see lots of hopeful things. I ministered among a lot of younger folks. Portland's not quite what Portlandia and the whole, where 20-year-olds go to retire kind of thing, that the reputation it kind of gained. But it is a lot of young folks. Yeah, it's kind of like that. And what's amazing is that the phenomena of deconstruction and de-churching that people are going through is largely kind of ironically out of a desire to preserve elements of the vision of Jesus that says, if it's between that and my religion, then kind of fuck my religion. I'm done. I'm and the hopefulness of that is that those folks, they take their neighbors pretty seriously, and they don't view their neighbors as a vehicle to getting to God, or in chalking up their neighbors or conversions as a kind of the work of the church. They have a much broader type of fundamental commitment to justice in the world. And I think those things are actually very, very hopeful. But the problem is, of course, that the work of the church is to organize our lives around not just that work, but our commitments to each other. And that's where it's so scary and difficult. I mean, as you're a pastor, you're making calls about masks and when and how we can gather, and you have half the people saying, bro, it's fear, what about faith? And then you have other people saying, I'll see it in 20 years. We're living in the Mad Max Thunderdome, and I probably will be piecing out of church for a long time because it's just too dangerous. And you're supposed to navigate these realities, and I have lots of younger folks in our church whose parents are very, very conservative, and they are not, And so this line that runs down the middle of churches and the middle of families that are dividing people against each other. And I think our work is to figure out how to love your enemy without abandoning the most vulnerable. That's the work. Churches are, they're right in the middle of it, because we're supposed to be constantly with one eye on the most vulnerable in our communities, drawing together these folks who really don't trust or like each other very much. Yeah. And so I think forgiveness is the biggest, most practical and powerful work of the church in this era. It's we have to minister forgiveness, forgiveness of sins. And that starts with each other. And I know it sounds super Pollyanna, but it's we're supposed to be the one place in a person's life that they're going to sit with with such radical difference that the only thing that brings them together is Jesus. So I love seeing the ways in which that's true in my church, and I cry and I stay up at night thinking about all the ways it's not.
Yeah.
You know?
Sameer, any thoughts?
My experience with students is very much echoes what Sharad's saying about what is driving people away from church and what is hopeful about even some of the Exodus is what's hopeful about it is reform or some kind of reconstruction of Christianity and what it's about, most basically about, that I think we should have some hope in. But I also think that, I mean, I guess, who was it? Was sociologist, was like Robert Withnow maybe, who talks about American religion as really uniquely indexed to political affiliation, and such that you have a more strong predictor of unity and disunity across political rather than religious lines.
Even than racial lines.
Even the racial lines, yeah. Right, exactly. So it's in a lot of ways a unique kind of situation in America, the American church. But it's also in a lot of ways a hangover from a kind of past that we're not really willing to confront.
Yeah.
What keeps me up at night is just the thing we were talking about earlier, about whether the truth of Christianity can be sustained by the existence of communities that show that it actually isn't just BS, you know?
Yeah.
And all it takes in order to be despairing about that is proximity to Christians. And so the kind of hard work that I think Sharad's talking about, the hard work of forgiveness, the hard work of reconciliation, that it's like when I think about reconciliation, forgiveness, and reparation, which I think has to be part of what we are talking about when we talk about reconciliation.
Amen.
When we're talking about all that kind of work, it's like some people hear that and they hear what Sharad described as kind of Pollyannish, kind of like, just sentimentality of kind of whatever. I hear those words and I think of like dismantling a nuclear weapon. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like the shaking hands, the plutonium, not wanting something to explode.
Wow.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Because the work of interpersonal relationship, when it's sort of ramified by the kind of context of polarization and so on, that work is something that is there's so much incentive that runs the other way to give up on it and just to draw up the battle lines and say, no, because I think one of the things that the need for mutual forgiveness, recovery, mutual submission to the way of Jesus, the mutual discernment about the way of Jesus, that work is so threatened by the both sidesism, by the kind of like, okay, so now let's come together and then here's why we have to acknowledge your viewpoint and my viewpoint, and they both have to be preserved so that our fundamental sense of security in our own views can be preserved in order to, as the precondition for this discernment, or conciliation or whatever it is, which is why I think it's so important to talk about a minimal constraint of attention to those most vulnerable.
That's exactly right. That's the barometer for this is not a kind of washed out libertarian. I mean, Jesus is not a moderate. The Sermon on the Mount is not moderate. So the idea of bringing together conservatives and liberals in some unified family together is not a kind of live and let live compromise. It's a mutual call to a deep repentance that actually rejects much of their shared project together in a vision as catastrophically beautiful as the Sermon on the Mount.
Man, you guys are dropping gold right here. I mean, this idea of that work, that hard work of unity in the church, not being some Pollyanna BS, but it's actually like fear and trembling and shaking hands. And it's almost like it's not even just any bomb, it's a time bomb. It feels like it's about to explode, right? So you got to do it quick, and you got to do it really carefully. And then this idea of Jesus isn't just asking us to all be moderates politically. Jesus is asking us to put all that BS to the wayside and unite under the mission and the way of Christ. I mean, we just solved all the church's problems right there.
And then the trick is doing it, and that's why I love that. It's funny. I was just scrolling through the show notes, and I saw that you had that quote from a Facebook post, and I actually didn't know I said any of that. Because I didn't really. I was skimming, and then I saw that quote, and I was like, man, that's fucking awesome. That is dead on. And then I saw that I said it, and I was like, oh. So but it's. I think the call to come and die and the call to sort of take our own, the words that we say on a Sunday morning, even when we do our routine confession of sin together for what we've done and what we've left undone, all of the kind of routine stuff that has such vapid content in our minds, like what you just said, it's harrowing work. It's a lot less like a group therapy session and a lot more like South Africa circa 96, truth and reconciliation. And that work you've got to be willing to have a lot of your life upset by it, So, and that's why I think the Kierkegaard connection with you guys, that's why I vibe with him so much, because his way of talking about Christianity will not let us off the hook for that stuff.
Right. And it's one of the things that I was going to say, actually, it's a very nice connection to that, which is like the Kierkegaardian kind of anti-Hegelianism. Yeah. And one dimension of that is this kind of idea that you can go with the grain of the social and moral and cultural context and zeitgeist in order to enact this. And so the profound ways in which very determinative features of our lives that are not have, whether it's neoliberal economic policies or whatever it is, might have to be really basically and fundamentally challenged just by a certain kind of form of life, which means it can't be sentimental because it's kind of damned. You know what I mean? Like there's no way to enact something like this without expecting failure in any sense of sort of the ability to go on, the kind of ability to sort of make your way and to kind of make peace with the ordinary course of life as it is handed to you. And that's what's so challenging to me, is that one of the distinctions between a kind of Protestant way of embodying some recognition of this and the Roman Catholic way in the Western tradition is to think about, at least in the Roman Catholic context, there's always been an acknowledgement of what Charles Taylor would call different speeds. That is to say, the monastic community bears the work of monastic communities can bear the work of doing this in a certain way, in a sense, on behalf of a wider community, and as a part of a project that is a realized eschatology that's doing battle for the sake of the kingdom with powers and principalities and so on, that simply cannot be realized by everyone. Because
they're not expected to do it.
And they can't, so we shouldn't expect it. But the priesthood of all believers in a Protestant kind of vision attempts to radicalize and democratize a certain kind of vision. Then the question becomes whether that also requires a weakening of the picture and a kind of collapsing back into something that can actually be enacted because it can go more easily with the way of things, And so that kind of tension of how do you enact something radical in the life of a Christian community that actually lifts up the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and reperforms it in the world faithfully is just, if it's a question that's not just a conceptual question or one that you're working out because you want to write a beautiful book that sells 8 copies to other people who work on those theological questions, and then you can put it on your CV and then live a normal middle class or upper middle class life of the professoriate. If that's not what you want, but what you want to actually figure out how to do it and see if it's doable, and then if it's not, then give up on Christianity, and if it is, then have hope that God in Christ is reconciling the world to himself, then you have to figure out how that performance is supposed to work. And that's the kind of thing that keeps me up at night.
That's why you go to church, Sameer. That's why you go to church. I mean, I know that's like there's a lot you have to swallow to do that, but the church lumbers towards that vision in a sort of drunken, wayward, they're lumbering towards it. But I think the role of a minister is, kind of like Eugene Peterson in The Apocalyptic Pastor says that the job of a pastor is to ruin people's lives. And so you stand at the back of the room,
Amen.
And people leave and say, oh, that was a nice sermon. And you're shaking hands and you're like, I'm trying to ruin your life. I'm trying to ruin your life. I'm trying to ruin your life. And that, I think what that means is that pastors have to have the vision from the eyes to see God enacting those realities inside the lives of their people, and then call attention to when they see it happening. They say, look at this brother who just gave his car away to this other brother who needed one, or look at this brother or sister whose family, their house just burned down, they need a place to live. Like all these different ways you see in not in macro scale socioeconomic upheaval, but inside the life of our community, disruptions of the normal course of this neoliberal picture of happiness. There are disruptions that actually that tear little windows into the world that you can look through those and say, this actually, I'm seeing something transcendent.
The kingdom of God is near.
And the kingdom of God is near. And pastors draw attention to that stuff. So that, because we're not going to see these things enacted in wholesale revolution. Although I'm having whiskey with a guy in a couple weeks who all of his Facebook posts are like, so when are we going to burn these buildings down? I mean, he's like, because we connected over the fact that we're both Christian anarchists. We both say that we're anarchists, but he's like ready to he's ready to go full
Sure, do not go burn
somebody.
these buildings down with this guy. Do not do that.
I know.
Especially with that beard, man. It's not going to go well.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's an
Heavy will be
attractive
pissed.
picture, but I think you can get impatient with small scale change. My friend Pastor John Lemon says most of the time you want to experience the magnificence and majesty of God, it's going to be on such a minuscule scale that if you don't have eyes to see it, because you're always looking for some sort of major eruption, it's kind of like Elijah in the cave, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like,
sure. The God of the mundane.
There are whispers of that stuff happening, and that should keep us from killing ourselves. So...
Friends, before we continue, we want to thank Storyhill BKC for their support. Storyhill BKC is a full menu restaurant, and their food is seriously some of the best in Milwaukee. On top of that, Storyhill BKC is a full-service liquor store featuring growlers of tap available to go, spirits, especially whiskeys and bourbons, thoughtfully curated regional craft beers, and 375 selections of wine. Visit StoryhillBKC.com for menu and more info. If you're in Milwaukee, you'll thank yourself for visiting Storyhill BKC, and if you're not, remember to support local. One more time, that's StoryhillBKC.com.
One thing that you've written about, Sameer, is apophatic theology and the ineffability of God. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on this as well, Sharad. How does that fact, if we can call that a fact, that God is in a deep sense unknowable, how does that challenge or contextualize the stuff we've been talking about living this thing out? We're living it out for a thing that fundamentally is beyond our kin. So,
and before you do that, Sameer, just contextualize for our listeners what apophatic theology means.
Yeah. Okay, well, I mean, I think we don't have to get super highfalutin here. I mean, the fact is that apophaticism, at the end of the day, is a way of recognizing that the object of our worship, if you are worshiping God, then the object of worship is beyond all creatures and beyond all finite capacity for comprehension. And guess what? We are a creature with finite capacities for comprehension, and therefore God must be beyond us, right? And so it's the Augustinian line he says in a sermon, he says it really clearly, it's si comprehendus non est Deus, right? If you can understand it, it ain't God,
That's
right?
That's right.
That's something I think that is so intuitively plausible. You know, it also reminds me of the Groucho Marx kind of line about not wanting to be a member of any club that would admit him, right?
Yeah.
Humans should not want to be a member of any club about God in which God remains comprehensible, can fit inside the club, right? I mean, like, that's apophaticism. Apophatic just means to speak away from, and the idea of speaking away from is the idea of being able to speak in negative terms about God, that is to say, to mark one's relationship to God by distance, by the way in which God is at a remove from us. And then, so now this leads to puzzles, like different kind of puzzles about language and stuff like that. How can we talk about something we can't talk about? Because look, I just talked about it, right? So when I say you can't talk about God, then you should ask the question, you can't talk about who? Who did you just say, right?
Yeah.
With
like,
your
what
words.
are we talking about right now?
Yeah. And there's always some smarmy analytic philosopher who's going to be saying that, and then you're going to want to slap them. But then you can't because you're a pacifist, and then you're like,
Yeah.
oh, wait, sorry.
And that's why you walk into a bar with your pastor.
Correct.
Yeah.
So instead, I mean, Peter Van Ilswyk is a philosopher of language who's done some really great work, interesting work. I think he's got an article that's going to be coming out on metalinguistic negation. What he means is to say, look, what we're trying to say when we talk in apophatic terms is we're not trying to say that our language doesn't do anything with
It's
respect
useless,
to God, or
yeah.
that it can't express truths or stuff like that. It's that to be an apophaticist is to express a certain kind of reluctance towards your own speech. So it's meta-linguistic. It's a way of stepping back towards your own and looking at your own speech and going, I guess, I don't know, I guess, kind of, right? And because it's a form of recognition, a form of reluctance about the capacity of your language to accommodate what it's about, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a wildly relevant approach to the overconfident, technocratic American religious ways of talking about God. I mean, Kierkegaard is obviously all over this, and so is Pascal, and this sort of different existentialist strains within the Christian faith. But of course, maybe most famously, Augustine has this attitude that says that God should not be instrumentalized. He makes the uti frui distinction, and he's like, there are things to be enjoyed and then there are things to be used. And our way of talking about God, if we don't want to instrumentalize him and turn him into a weapon or a tool in our own hands, we have to constantly recognize that we do not grasp, we are grasped by God.
That's right.
And so, in my mind, the apophatic attitude, to use Sameer's phrase, and the wonder requisite to Christian epistemology, that all of that is a way of affirming the most fundamental aspect of Christian conversion, which is that it's God that grasps us, not we that grasp him. Yep. And language is a huge part of the way we exercise categorical control over the world. So when I think ministers particularly have to be very, very careful to consistently remind people through our liturgies, the shape of them, the way we do them, and through the kinds of words we speak, that we are lunging desperately at realities way bigger than we can comprehend.
Yeah.
And what we're not doing is cataloging a creature in a jar, when we talk about God. So I think,
what Willie Jennings calls like speaking from the commanding heights.
Yes, the command. Oh, what a cool phrase! Where eagles dare, how the Misfits would put it. Which the chorus is, "I ain't no goddamn son of a bitch," and I think that's a good way
chorus.
It's a great way of avoiding the commanding heights. Is to recognize I have no conceptual, spiritual, emotional capacity to bear something as fundamental as God in my language.
That's right.
And of course, that's what the experience of worship is. That's what wordless wonder is.
That's right.
Wonder is at its apogee when we have nothing left to say. So yeah,
it's got physiological sort of manifestation, right? The slack jaw, the wide eyes, the
right, exactly. The yokel look on your face.
We're really going back to that sort of hick Southern thing a lot here. When we,
sorry.
It's low-hanging fruit.
But some of my best friends are from the South.
The other thing I want to say is like the inevitable thing about this, right? Is what about revelation? What about aren't there truths that we know about God?
Well, what about Jesus? I think is the biggest.
What
question.
about Jesus? Right?
Oh man, but so here's the beautiful thing about Chalcedonian formulations of Jesus and about Trinitarian theology in general.
Reach it.
That the more you understand about these realities, the deeper your incomprehension goes. So mysteries are not placeholders for knowledge we don't have. That's not what a mystery is. A mystery is something that as you approach it and you grow in the understanding of a thing, it opens even wider fields of absolute incomprehension.
So Gregory of Nyssa calls it pectasy, right? The straining and stretching in which. Yeah. So what I was going to say though is that so what about truth values of the claims we make about the Trinity and all this kind of stuff about the incarnation and whatever and and how does knowability and unknowability kind of connect to one another? And I like this little paper of Bill Alston's called Two Cheers for Mystery. I don't know if you ever read that one. Two Cheers for Mystery.
I like the title.
It's a good title. And I think he just gives an analogy that I think is really apt. And he says, look, I explain to my, I don't remember how old he said his granddaughter, like 4 or 5 year old granddaughter, what I'm doing when I go to work. I might do that in a way that I have to accommodate my explanation to the limits of her comprehension. And so I have to be able to say something within terms that are graspable for her, because I'm trying to express something that I know can only be expressed and received if it's accommodated, right?
Right.
And so the accommodation is like, okay, so hey, you know how you color with crayons on your I mean, and I extend the analogy in a little way, but he's like, you know how you color on crayons and on your paper, and then when we really like it, you know, if it doesn't suck, we put it on the refrigerator. Like, this is like a really meritocracy kind of a. Like,
And they're crying while you're explaining.
Yeah,
it.
yeah, right.
This one didn't
that's
make
kind of
it.
what I do. You know, I go to work and I write. I think of arguments and whatever, and I write them down, and then peer review and publication really is just they get put on the refrigerator or whatever, right? So the basic idea is, he says, well, look, it's not the case that that she doesn't know anything, that she hasn't been sufficiently informed. It has truth values and, you know, and whatever, but she can't stand back and see how the analogy works in order to see what the correlations are, right?
Because she only has one half of it.
She only has her standpoint.
Right.
And if that's what we're saying about whatever, about, you know, and Calvin says this is very
it's
traditional.
standard.
It's standard to say God stoops, you know, to reveal. And even God's self-revelation in Christ in the incarnation is a veiling of God through the manifestation of the humanity of Jesus. God comes through the humanity of Jesus. And so that's a kind of veiling of God through manifestation, right? And a kind of ultimate accommodation to us and for us.
And so the veiling is also the revealing.
Right.
It's like the veiling is the revealing, and the stymieing wonder of that indescribable union of God and man in Jesus is the most profound and direct knowledge we can have of God. This incomprehension is actually what is the only pathway to any comprehension. You know what I mean? So that's kind of I think the relationship between mystery and knowledge.
Yeah. You know, the other thing I'll say about this is that oftentimes in these contexts, the talk about the relevant kind of ignorance involved, the relevant kind of mystery involved, because in philosophy of religion context, this talk often happens around the metaphysics and epistemology questions and the questions about the semantic content of propositions and stuff like that. It often gets separated from the question of appreciation. So there's a certain way in which mystery is a normative concept. It's something that is to be appreciated as a mystery. So it's not just a knowledge gap or an information gap or something like that. That's the kind of the way in which, like what Sharad was talking about earlier. And so that's the sense in which mystery, the kind of mystery involved is what leads people who think and reflect on it, theologians who have reflected on it, to want to put the modifier in to call it like a holy mystery, you know, because it's a kind of something that's supposed to generate its own sense of sacredness or separateness.
You can't just be like, oh, that's interesting. I mean, it's arresting.
Yep.
It's
Yeah,
arresting.
exactly. It's not curiosity.
It grabs your face and pulls it in. In fact, I think one of the most animating convictions in my own vocation is the deep belief that human beings are inexhaustible wells of mysterious glory and goodness. I mean, if you are, that's why, you know, in characterizing what a pastor does, saying that it's about paying attention means that if you are not arrested by the glory resident in other human beings, however you find them, you can't do this work. You know?
Yeah.
No matter who they are,
Yep.
you know? And you can name test cases of people who are particularly difficult to do that with. But it's not sanctimonious or saccharine to say that in that person is depths of profound wonder that if only they knew, you know? They probably wouldn't be such an asshole.
Yeah, it's what Howard Thurman calls the altar in every human, in every heart.
The way of the heart. That's in the way of the heart.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think if there is any uniqueness or expertise to pastoral work, and if that does have something to do with drawing attention to the presence of God and drawing people into union with God, that means not creating spaces and experiences and language that's all separate from the daily course of a person's life. It means recognizing all the stuff of being alive is an encounter with God. And that's what I like about the democratizing aspect of Protestant thinking is that it says that is everybody's spiritual vitality. It's in their ability to perceive the presence, activity, beauty, power, sustenance, nourishment of God in the basic features of the life you already live. You know? And to me, that's why mysticism is really also just another way of talking about Christian experience.
Yep.
It's not a special form or a heightened plane. It's just being a Christian, I think.
Yep.
So maybe in the church we need a few less Bible studies and a little bit more contemplative prayer and silent retreats, perhaps.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, Bible studies are important. Don't email that I hate Bible studies.
Yeah.
Why do you hate the Bible?
I don't understand why these guys hate the Bible so much. But I think maybe, generally speaking, it's probably accurate to say anything Augustine and Gregory both said. Gregory said it better. But I do like sometimes, especially in the Confessions, the way that Augustine talks about the world almost as a kind of portal to God. I mean, it's like the sacramentality of the world is, I think, the beating heart of Christian experience. It's like you have to have the imagination to be able to sit on the Max train next to, some dude tweaking out on mushrooms and hear the running of the rail under the car of the train and smell the musty odor of human beings packed like sardines and look at this person sitting next to you out of his mind because he's running from who knows what. And you have to be able to look around and with your senses apprehend something more than what you're seeing, And that ability to do that is the ability to experience God, which is why most of my atheist friends that when we have conversations, and we do, sit, smoke cigarettes on my friend's porch, talking about the stuff he's going through. What I'm hearing is this dude experienced God all day long,
He doesn't see it.
And what's interesting are ways in which he does and doesn't see that, So mysticism also blurs the line between the believers and the unbelievers. It's like everything and everyone participates in the goodness of God, and there's sliding scale of apprehension of that, but it blurs those lines in exciting ways.
Yeah, that's really good. Really good, Sharad.
Should we be done, or do you want to talk about racism?
Well, that's actually a great motto for the United States.
Should we be done, or do you want to talk about race?
But it's a rhetorical question, right? It's a rhetorical question.
But it's a rhetorical question.
Yeah, right. Yes, we are. We do want to be done.
Yeah, let's be done. But I think we need to, whether it's in a year from now or whatever, it'd be fun if you guys are willing to sit with another pastor and another philosopher, and that's us, by the way.
To do it again.
Do this again. This is fun.
Oh, so great, man. Thank you guys so much for giving us the chance to do it.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. We always enjoy the chance to be able to sort of, hang out and talk with each other. So this was a nice.
Anywhere our listeners can find whether it's your papers, your sermons. I don't know if you have any books or anything between the two of you.
You don't need to listen to my sermons. Really, they're really.
No, you should. You should.
No, they're not that great.
I think they should.
But if you ever want to come visit me in person, I'd love to chill and drink coffee or beer or whiskey and just shoot the breeze. And our church is in Portland, Oregon. It's called Bread and Wine, and you can find us at breadandwine.org. And we're on Facebook. We have a Bread and Wine page on Facebook as well. Or you can just friend me on Facebook. I'm profligate on there. I'm a real whore. Anyone who's shows moderate interest to me, I'm like, yeah, I'm your friend. I'm your friend. I'm your friend. So I would, message me. But yeah, that's how you can reach me. The website and the Facebook page. So.
Sameer?
I've got a book with Fortress Press, 2015. It's called The Problem of Perception and the Experience of God.
Amazing book.
It's really not, but it's about religious experience. About the last few chapters are about Gregory of Nyssa, and it's about the structure of religious experience. And then I also have various papers and articles and stuff on various topics about religious experience and about race. I'm very interested in something we haven't talked about, the connection between the stuff we were talking about with respect to mysticism and with respect to the sort of vocation of theology, and also thinking about race and racial formation and how we should think about the intersection between race and religion. So I have written on some of that stuff in the philosophy of religion as well as in theology, and those are projects that I'm still working on. So I suppose somebody could just have a ResearchGate and an academia page, and people could just look
Awesome.
Yeah, we'll put some of that stuff in the show notes if anybody wants to go deeper.
Yeah,
Having read
yeah,
some of that,
that's
I'd
cool.
recommend it.
Yeah, Sameer also has some stuff on the conversation, I think, right? Online, don't you?
I have just like an article I co-wrote with Helen Cruz and whatever, but you can just sort of Google me if you're interested, or shoot me a note. I'm at Westmont, it's syadav@westmont.edu, and you can send me any questions or
You
whatever
guys-
you want. Or email.
If you want to show up at his house, the following is his personal address. So he loves that. He loves drop-ins.
Yeah. You guys are so sweet, championing each other's work.
Sameer is a wild introvert, by the way. So
Yeah.
So
Nice.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being on the show. It was
Yeah.
awesome.
thank
Great
you
time.
guys. It's so fun.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, right on.
Thanks for listening to A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, please rate and review the podcast before you close your app. You can also share the episode with friends or family members with the links from our social media pages. Gain inside access, extra perks, and more at patreon.com/apastorandafilosopher. We're so grateful for your support of the podcast. Until next time, this has been A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.